Later today, the House is going to be voting on whether to ban the controversial social media app TikTok. Joining us right now with what the potential long-term risks could be is Tobin. He's the head of policy and politics at Wolfe Research. Good morning to you. Let's just start with handicapping the possibility of this vote today, but maybe more importantly, what happens next when it goes to the Senate.
Absolutely. The House vote today, I think, is very likely to move forward. There seems to be very little doubt about that. Certainly the folks in the House who are spearheading this push are expressing complete confidence that they're going to get it through. The Senate, I think, is a much bigger question. You know, we're not really seeing any sign that Senate leaders feel pressured by the actions of the House to do anything here. In general, the Senate doesn't really like to take marching orders from the House. So, you know, I think you look at key senators like Maria Cantwell, the chair of Senate Commerce, or Mark Warner, who has his own bill on this. You know, I think their view is going to be, we have our own approaches to this problem. We agree that TikTok is an issue, but the fact that the House, you know, sort of suddenly snapped into action over the course of the past week is not necessarily going to mean that we need to kind of leap to take their direction on where we're supposed to go. So I think the Senate piece of this is kind of going to quietly grind to a halt. I'm not sure that we're going to see anything in terms of immediate action in the Senate. And there aren't going to be a lot of opportunities to tack this onto anything else that the Senate's doing going forward. There really are not a lot of bills that are going to get done before D.C. moves fully into election mode and Congress shuts down.
Your read of this bill, and there seems to be a debate even on the Hill about this and within the TikTok world and others about whether this is a divestiture bill, and it uses the word divestiture in multiple places in the bill itself, or what some people are describing as a ban bill, meaning that the practical ramifications of the way the bill is set up, given the timeline of not just the 6 months, but how it would have to operate around the world and whatnot, that effectively it could not operate. Which do you believe?
I think given what I expect in Beijing, this will probably end up being an effective ban. I think from the perspective of the sponsors of this bill, I think they would be perfectly happy to see divestiture. So the idea that this entire thing is intended to orchestrate a ban, I think is not really correct. But, you know, China has said explicitly in response to past CFIUS noise that they might try and force a divestiture, that they're not going to allow that. That seems to be the message from ByteDance leadership as well. I have no particular reason to doubt that that's the case. I mean, certainly from a U.S.-China perspective, the idea that we're just going to kind of expropriate this this sort of prized internet company is obviously going to rub folks the wrong way in Beijing. So, you know, if they refuse to approve a sale, then it ends up being a ban. So I'm more concerned about that than, you know, the kind of logistics of finding a buyer on the requisite timeline. That's also challenging. But I think if there were will, it's conceivable you could get that done. But again,
and what do you think the ramifications would be from on the Chinese side, right? I mean, I think, you know, if you're sitting in Beijing today and you try to put yourself in their shoes, I'm not talking about the government, I'm talking about just entrepreneurs and the like. This is one of those situations where, you know, an entrepreneur starts a company, it works in a very big way, and effectively it looks like the U.S. is trying to kill the business. What do you think that does inside of China and to the relationship with the U.S.? And does it matter?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously not good from a U.S.-China relations perspective. You know, it's one of a number of important points of tension in our economic relationship, but I think the semiconductor export controls being at least as important. So it's certainly not as if we're sort of roiling a relationship that had been going well up to that point. You know, from the Chinese side, they've had very mixed messages, of course, to investors over the course of the past couple of years. On the one hand, made various attempts to kind of court foreign investment, say we are open for business, but then you know, actions like the kind of crackdown on tech on and off over the course of the past couple of years, things like the way that Alipay was treated when it was kind of snatched away from Yahoo in significant part. You know, it's not as if this is a reliable regime that you can kind of count on for rule-based governance of investment.
And are you a believer, and we haven't seen what some of these classified meetings might have suggested, that the Chinese government is actually using TikTok in a meaningful way to influence our society? Or do you think that the truth is that this is about the prospect, if you will, that given the reach of TikTok, if the government were to want to do that, it could, but hasn't done so yet?
Yeah, I think more the latter. You know, when you look at the suggestive evidence that's advanced by people about sort of TikTok as a propaganda instrument by the Chinese Communist Party, it tends to mostly revolve around the suppression of topics of concern to Beijing. In terms of what people have identified so far, in terms of kind of problematic patterns of what gets advanced by the algorithm. But the concern that you hear raised more and more in DC is that it's really hard to detect this stuff. There's not like a line of code that you can point to, which I think is part of the problem with the Project Texas kind of mitigation plan that TikTok has been developing over the course of the past few years in response to national security concerns in their CFIUS process. Even if you have total access to the source code, it's not necessarily going to be easy to identify, efforts to change at the margin what kinds of content people are seeing. So certainly, I think the prospective concern is very real, sort of easy to understand how this would be a problem in terms of direct influence in U.S. elections. And, I think that is probably adequate to motivate the action.